Hello Year 5, welcome to Thursday's guided reading session where we are going to be doing a bit of Rex retrieval on the next bit of the story. So on the website you've got this piece of paper here, a true or false. If you think these facts are true, give them a tick. If you think they are false, then you need to rewrite the sentence so that it's true using the evidence from the text. For example, if you think the townsfolk were not gathered in the White Rabbit Tavern, you're going to need a bit of Rex retrieval to find the name of the tavern and then rewrite it so that it's a correct sentence. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do together is read page 21 to 29. And if you remember yesterday, we left off with, so Fritz cleared his throat and arranged his papers and began to read. Remember your predictions for what the story was going to be about. How accurate were they? Fritz's story. I wonder if any of you remember the extraordinary business at the palace a few years ago. They tried to hush it up, but some details came out, and a bizarre mystery it was too. It seemed that Prince Otto had taken his young son Florian hunting, together with an old friend of the royal family, Baron Stelgratz. It was the dead of winter, just like now. They'd set off in a sledge for the hunting lodge up in the mountains, well wrapped up against the cold, and they weren't expected back for a week or so. Well, what should happen but that only 2 nights later, the sentry on duty at the palace gate saw a commotion down the road and heard the whinnying of horses, whinnying in panic, making a terrible racket, and it looked as though he couldn't be sure, as if a sledge was being driven towards the palace by a madman. The sentry raised the alarm and called for lights, and when the sledge got close enough they could see that it was the royal sledge, the very one the prince had set off in only 2 nights before. It was hurtling up the road behind those terrified horses, and it wasn't going to stop, and the sergeant of the guard gave orders to drag the palace gates open quickly before it crashed. They got them open just in time. The sledge rushed through and then drove round and round the courtyard, for the horses were mad with fear and couldn't stop. The poor beasts were covered with foam and their eyes were rolling, and the sledge would be going round that courtyard still if one of the runners hadn't caught on a mountain block and turned the whole thing over. Out fell the driver, and out fell a bundle from the back of the sledge. A servant hastened to pick it up and found the little Prince Florian wrapped in a fur rug, safe and warm and half asleep. But as for the driver, well, as soon as the sentries came close, they saw who it was. It was none other than Prince Otto himself, stark dead, as cold as ice, with his eyes wide and staring ahead of him, his left hand gripping the reins so tight they had to be cut loose, and, this was the strangest part, his right hand still moving, lashing the whip up and down, up and down, up and down. They covered him up so the princess wouldn't see him, and took little Prince Florian to her to prove he was alive and well, because he was their only child. But what was to be done with Prince Otto? They took his body into the palace and sent for the royal physician, a worthy old man who'd studied in Heidelberg and Paris and Bologna, and who'd published a treatise on the location of the stole. He'd studied geology and hydrology and physiology, but he'd never seen anything like this before. A dead body that wouldn't keep still. Imagine that, stretched out icy cold on a marble slab, with its right arm lashing and lashing and lashing, with no sign that it was ever going to stop. There's a little aside here from the author. There was a lot of argument about the location of the soul in those days. Some philosophers thought that it was located in the brain, some in the heart, some in the pineal gland, wherever that is. They even used to weigh people before and after they died to see whether they weighed less when their soul had left them. I don't know whether they did or not. The physician locked the door to keep the servants out and brought the lamp closer and bent low to look, and then his eye was caught by something in the clumsy arrangement of clothes. So, avoiding that lashing right arm, he carefully unfastened the cloak and the fur coat and the underjacket and the shirt and laid the prince's chest bare. And there it was. A gash across his breast just over his heart, crudely sewn up with a dozen stitches. The physician got his scissors and snipped them away, and then he nearly fainted with surprise, because when he opened the wound, there was no heart there. Instead, there was a little piece of clockwork, just a few cogs and springs and a balance wheel, attached in subtle ways to the prince's veins and tick, tick, ticking away merrily, in perfect time with the lashing of his arm. Well, you can imagine how the physician crossed himself and took a sip of brandy to calm his nerves. Who wouldn't? Then he carefully cut the attachments and lifted out the clockwork, and as he did so, the arm fell still, just like that. As he got to that point in his story, Fritz paused for a sip of beer and to see how his audience was taking it. The silence in the inn was so profound. Every single customer was sitting so still they might have been dead themselves, except for their wide eyes and expressions of tense excitement. He had never had such a success. He turned the page and read on. Fritz's story continued. Well, the physician sewed up Prince Otto's wound and let it be known that the prince had died of apoplexy. The servants who carried the body in thought differently. They knew a dead man when they saw one, even if his arm was moving. At any rate, the official version was that Prince Otto had suffered a contusion of the brain, and that his love for his son had kept him alive just long enough to drive him safely home. He was buried with a good deal of ceremony, and everyone was in mourning for 6 months. As far as for what happened to Baron Stelgratz, the other member of the hunting party, no one could guess. The whole affair was shrouded in mystery. But the royal physician had an idea. There was one man who might be able to explain what had happened, and that was the great Dr. Calminus of Strasbourg, of whom very few people had heard, but those who did know him said that he was the cleverest man in Europe. For making clockwork he had no equal, not even our good Herr Rinkelmann. He could make intricate pieces of calculating apparatus that worked out the positions of all the stars and the planets and answers any mathematical questions. Dr. Calmenius could have made his fortune if he'd wanted to, but he wasn't interested in fortune or in fame. He was interested in something far deeper than that. He would spend hours sitting in graveyards, contemplating the mysteries of life and death. Some said he experimented on dead bodies. Others said he was in league with the powers of darkness. No one knew for certain, but one thing they did know was that he used to walk about at night, pulling behind him a little sledge containing whatever secret matter he was working on at that time. What did he look like, this philosopher of the night? He was very tall and thin, with a prominent nose and jaw. His eyes blazed like coals in the caverns of darkness. His hair was long and grey, and he wore a black cloak with a loose hood like that of a monk. He had a harsh, grating voice, and his expression was full of savage curiosity. And that was the man who... Fritz stopped. He swallowed, and his eyes moved to the door. Everyone followed his gaze. The parlour had never been so still. No one moved. No one dared to breathe, for the latch was lifting. The door slowly opened. On the threshold stood a man in a long black cloak with a loose hood like a monk's. His grey hair hung down on either side of his face, a long, narrow face with a prominent nose and jaw and eyes that looked like burning coals in the caverns of darkness. Oh, the silence as he stepped inside! Every single person in the parlour was gaping, mouth open, eyes wide, and when they saw what the stranger was pulling behind him, a little sledge with something wrapped in canvas, more than one crossed themselves and stood up in fear. The stranger bowed. "Dr. Calmenius of Salzburg at your service," he said in a harsh, grating voice. "I have come a long way tonight, and I am cold. A glass of brandy." I'm going to stop there. Oh my goodness. So, the character of Fritz's story has just turned up in the tavern where Fritz is telling the story. How freaky is that? Okay. We're going to pause there. But before I do that, I'm going to read you this second aside here. from the author, and it's got a picture in it. It's quite difficult for you to see, unfortunately, but here is the aside. It's all about Dr. Calmenius's clockwork. There was something uncanny about Dr. Calmenius's clockwork. He made little figures that sang and spoke and played chess and shot tiny arrows from tiny bows and played the harpsichord as well as Mozart. You can see some of his clockwork figures today in the museum at Schatzberg, but they don't work anymore. It's odd because all the parts are in place and in perfect order and they should work, but they don't. It's almost as if they had died. All very intriguing. Okay, so pause me here. Have a go at our true or false sheet here. Unpause me, and then we will move on to the next part of our guided reading session. Okay, so pause me and then unpause me in 3, 2, 1. Okay, I hope you've managed to find out whether these were true or false. Hopefully you've spotted that they were actually in the White Horse Tavern, not the White Rabbit Tavern, using that Rex retrieval to help you out. Okay, now we're going to recap this little paragraph on page chapter 27, which is all about what Dr. Calmenius looks like. Okay, while I'm reading this bit, jot down the key features, and these are going to help you out in our English sessions. Okay, what did he look like, this philosopher of the night? He was very tall and thin, with a prominent nose and jaw. His eyes blazed like holes in the caverns of darkness. His hair was long and grey, and he wore a black cloak with a loose hood like that of a monk. He had a harsh, grating voice, and his expression was full of savage curiosity. Okay, so what have I pulled out there? He's very tall and thin. His eyes blaze like holes in the caverns of darkness. What beautiful description is that? He has a very prominent nose and jaw, and that means prominent means it sticks out quite far. So he's got quite a long nose, and his jaw is quite pointed. His hair was long and grey, and he wore a black cloak with a loose hood like that of a monk. All right, fantastic, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this week's guided reading. Head over to English as well, where we are doing more exploring of both the story and some of the skills that we can learn to weave into it as well. Bye bye, guys.